Good morning. My name is Dave, and last week we started a brand new sermon series entitled Trial. During this sermon series, we're going to spend our time together looking at a section of a letter that's recorded for us in the Bible to give us a glimpse into a trial that occurred some 2,000 years ago. This trial involved a case that was brought against all of humanity by the Apostle Paul on behalf of God. During this sermon series, we'll have an opportunity as we get a glimpse into this trial to evaluate the evidence so be able to come to a conclusion beyond a shadow of a doubt as to whether or not we are guilty or innocent when it comes to whether or not we have a problem with God. Last week we began this sermon series by discovering the timeless truth that we are guilty of having a problem with God when we leave God out and live as though He does not exist. In Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, we saw the Apostle Paul provide two pieces of evidence to prove that we are guilty of having a problem with God when we leave God out and live as though He does not exist. First, we discovered that we are guilty of leaving God out and living life as though He does not exist because we ignore the evidence within us when it comes to creation. We discovered that all humanity throughout history has this intuitive sense that there is something out there bigger and beyond them that created the universe called God. And because every human being throughout history has had and experienced this intuitive sense of something out there bigger and beyond them that created the universe called God, Paul stated that humanity is without excuse. In other words, no human being could say that they did not know that God exists, because the evidence of God's existence is overwhelming through the creation. And that evidence has been placed within us. Second, we discovered that we are guilty of leaving God out and living as though He does not exist because we ignore the evidence that's revealed by our rebellion. When we leave God out and live as though He does not exist, we rebel against God's design for worship. We rebel against God's design for marriage and sexuality, and we rebel against God's design for relationships. And it is this rebellion against God's design that reveals the reality that we are guilty of having a problem with God because we have left God out and we are living as though He does not exist. We ended our time last week by recognizing that many people would say, well, Dave, I'm not like those people. I don't ignore God. I don't leave God out. I'm a good moral person. And because I'm a good moral person, I don't think I have a problem with God. So am I guilty? This morning, as we continue in this sermon series, I would like for us to spend our time together looking back into another section of this letter that was written by the Apostle Paul to a first century church located in Rome. And as we look at this section of this letter, we will see the Apostle Paul ask and answer this question. So let's begin by looking together at Romans chapter 2, verse 1. Romans chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. If you don't have a Bible, that's okay. The words will be behind me on the screen. They're also in your bulletin. We'd love to be able to give you a Bible. If you don't have one, you can just stop by the welcome desk at the end of the service. We'd love to give you one as a gift. So let's look at these verses together. Romans chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Paul states the following. Therefore, you have no excuse, every one of you who passes judgment. For in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. But do you suppose this, O man, when you pass judgment on those who practice such things and do the same yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you think lightly of the riches of His kindness and tolerance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads to repentance? But because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. Paul begins this section of his letter to the members of the Church of Rome by addressing what we would call in our culture today a moralist. A moralist is a person who does not believe that they have a problem with God because they are good moral people who live by a code of conduct or standards. And it is this code of conduct or standards that they live by that the moralist uses to judge others. When Paul uses the phrase pass judgment, this phrase literally means to pass an unfavorable judgment on the lives or actions of others. In other words, the person who views themselves as a moralist bases their opinion on the fact that they are a good moral person who lives by a code of conduct that they follow and that they use to justify that they are better than other people. You see, the moralist life is often based and driven by comparison. Well, I'm a much better person than these other people because I'm a good moral person that follows a code of conduct that others don't. But notice what the Apostle Paul says to the moralist. Therefore, you have no excuse. In other words, the moralist has no excuse that they can use to show that they are not guilty when it comes to having a problem in terms of their relationship with God. And here we see the Apostle Paul provide for us a timeless and true charge when it comes to show that we are guilty of having a problem with God. And that timeless and true charge is this. We are guilty when we live life as though we can achieve moral excellence. We are guilty when we live life as though we can achieve moral excellence. This morning, we are guilty of having a problem when it comes to our relationship with God when we live life as though we can achieve a moral standard of excellence that God would approve of. And in Romans chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, we see the Apostle Paul provide 3 pieces of evidence that serve to prove that we are guilty of having a problem with God when we live life as though we can achieve moral excellence. First, the Apostle Paul charges that we are guilty based on the evidence of our own violations. We are guilty based on the evidence of our own violations. Paul explains that the moralist has no defense that they can use to deny that they are guilty because that in which they judge another, they condemn themselves. Because you who judge practice the same things. Now, if the Apostle Paul was writing this letter today in the language that we use in our culture, this verse would sound like this. You have no excuse for your behavior. You have no excuse because the very code of conduct that you use to pass judgment and condemn others provides the evidence of your own guilt. You are guilty because you don't even live up to the code of conduct that you use to judge others. You do not practice what you preach. Paul then contrasts the judgmental and hypocritical attitude of the moralist with the judgment of God. When Paul uses the phrase that God's judgment rightly falls, this phrase literally means rightly or truly. Unlike the subjective and debatable moral standards of the moralists, God's judgment is always the same. It never wavers. God will judge all of humanity based on His absolute standards. And because of that reality, the Apostle Paul then exposes the moralist to 2 timeless implications that flow from their guilt of attempting to live life as though they can achieve moral excellence. First, the Apostle Paul exposes the moralist to the implications that flow from them not being able to keep their own code of conduct. Because if you believe that you are a good moral person, because you are able to keep a code of conduct that you use to judge other people, then what happens when you violate your own code of conduct? What happens? This morning, do you believe that you're a good moral person based on the fact that you keep a code of conduct that you use to judge and condemn other people? If so, then here's the question. Have you ever violated your own code of conduct? Because if you believe that you can sit in judgment and condemn others based on them violating your code of conduct, then what happens to you when you violate your own code of conduct that you use to judge others?